Hello and welcome to a video by Xylem and Stomata Audio. In this video we are going to describe the evolution of a DAWless MIDI studio setup, from very simple beginner level to a much more complex hybrid setup. Let's begin. This is the current studio setup. With the exception of the CME boxes, which we will get into later, all of the items that you can see were purchased used. This point will become more relevant as we get into the video, but suffice it to say that this setup has been acquired over time for far less than the retail price of these items would suggest. It is also important to point out that studio monitors and a few other pieces of gear are off camera in this shot, as this setup is part of a more complete studio. This is something that we will discuss at the very end of the video. Lastly, before we begin, this particular evolution is just one of many paths that people might follow in getting to their ideal DAWless studio, so we are not defining the only/best path, we are just describing our particular path. So let's go back to the beginning. Like many, we started out as live musicians in a band, where MIDI was not really a part of the equation. Everyone plugged their instruments into an amplifier or a mixer, and if you had more than one keyboard, both were plugged in from an audio perspective. The advent of affordable multi-track recorders and drum machines allowed the primary writers for the band to create rough demos, which could be easily used in rehearsals, in addition to, or in place of, sheet music. It also allowed us to control more than one device from a single keyboard. For example, we could introduce a percussion component to a song, or to add horns when we had no horn section. All of this was possible because we could connect the devices that needed to remain in sync to each other via a 5-pin MIDI cable. Brilliant! Fast forward to today, and MIDI can allow you to do all sorts of very sophisticated functions between multiple devices that go far beyond just playing notes or starting and stopping a drum machine. MIDI has 16 channels or addresses, so you can send information to a specific device or to multiple devices depending on the address that you have set for them. So at a very simple level, you can connect the MIDI out port of a synthesizer or MIDI controller to the MIDI in port of another synthesizer and allow the first to play notes and sounds on the second. If both devices are set to the same MIDI channel, then you have effectively created a layered instrument where both devices will respond to any note played. You could also have your drum machine set up on another MIDI channel, so it would begin to play/stop at your command. You could play a horn stab with an electronic drum pad. In our specific evolution, this allowed us to create more complete songs, rather than just taking a quick idea to rehearsal. As we lost band members, or bands broke up and formed anew, music could still be created and shared, without very expensive studio time. Life was good. MIDI also spawned the development of MIDI controllers, which were just keyboards that produced no sound of their own. It was a natural progression to then have synthesizer modules which had no keyboard. Both of these reduced costs significantly in some cases, and allowed for a setup where a single MIDI controller could command an orchestra of synthesizer modules, drum machines, samplers, and sequencers. Of course, MIDI controllers then became more sophisticated by incorporating sequencers and drum machines. Synth modules did the same, until you get to the variety of devices that we know today. Meanwhile, computers and digital audio workstations, DAW, were of course evolving exponentially, but this particular video is about a DAWless setup, so we are setting that aside. In our configuration A diagram, we have depicted our relatively simple beginning state, where a synth, or a MIDI controller, is connected to a synth module, synth B, which in turn connects to a drum machine. This takes advantage of the MIDI through function, which allows MIDI data sent to a device to be split so that it is executed on the first device, and a copy is also passed on without alteration to a second device, creating a potential daisy chain of devices. Many modern devices have either a dedicated MIDI through port, or they have the ability to configure their MIDI out port to behave like a MIDI through port. There are many good videos available on the web for understanding MIDI, and a few links are included in the description. This is also a good place to point out that almost every MIDI-capable device from the last 10 years will have an option to handle MIDI via USB. This video is about our evolution, so for the sake of simplicity, and for reasons mentioned later in this video, we are sticking to a traditional 5-pin DIN MIDI configuration. Moving right along, our configuration B diagram gets us to the next stage of evolution. In this stage, we have multiple modules and synths that we want to control from a single MIDI controller or synth. From our previous configuration diagram, you may ask, why not just daisy chain them all? Good question. The answer is that most experts, and even the MIDI spec itself, suggest that there is a limit of around 3 or 4 devices before you begin to introduce potential issues in the signal chain. From practical experience, we believe that it may be even less than that in many circumstances. The first circumstance or practical reality is that not all manufacturers implement the MIDI protocol equally. Not all aspects of the MIDI spec are included in every MIDI device, In fact, it is common practice to include a MIDI implementation sheet in the manual for the device, so that you know what the capabilities are. More importantly, the variations may lead to issues not only with functionality, but with things as basic as timing. We have experienced drop notes, hung notes, and strange glitches in some cases that we never fully traced. However, they were almost all solved by shortening the daisy chain to 1 or 2 devices, and/or by introducing a MIDI splitter or a MIDI through box. These boxes are dedicated to receiving, manipulating, transforming, and sending MIDI with close to zero latency. A few examples are in the description. To summarize this phase, we could now play, sequence, and control multiple devices with a combination of daisy chaining and the use of a MIDI splitter/through box. At this point, before we get on to the next configuration, we need to introduce some goals and some caveats that guided the evolution of this next stage. First, as already referenced, we wanted to limit the number of daisy chain devices to 2. Second, we had a goal of never needing to plug in or unplug a 5-pin MIDI cable. This meant that we could configure the studio once and then leave it that way. Crawling behind the rack and under the desk was to be a thing of the past. Third, we had a goal of never needing to reassign MIDI channels for devices. This means that once a MIDI channel was assigned to a device, it would retain that assignment, and we could easily address a device just by remembering its MIDI channel. Next, the config has to handle more than one master, meaning one of several devices can be the master clock/sequencer, with all other devices following along. Another criteria was that this entire DAWless setup needs to function within the context of a larger hybrid environment. This means that the studio does not need to be physically reconfigured when a computer and DAW were being used. This point was mentioned up front because it was another reason to stick with a DIN cable configuration. There have been a few attempts to get this DAWless setup working via USB, which led to a less than stable setup in a variety of ways which are outside the scope of this video. Suffice it to say that the DIN setup has been functional and stable. Lastly, we wanted the ability to record the output of jamming or more structured performances without the computer. Although not strictly a MIDI component, recording capability drives a component of the diagram and the photo that you may have noticed: the mixer. So that's it for configuration B. With the computer and the USB hub powered off, this config allows for the creation and recording of tracks. Configuration C is a slightly simplified version of the current setup you see in the photo. We are using MIDI boxes from CME, links below, purchased with our own funds, and there is no relationship with them. This can be accomplished with several other brands, once again, links below. The CME boxes were added at different points in time, and they collectively do a few things. They allow the connection of multiple devices with minimal daisy chaining. They provide a MIDI host function, which would otherwise require a computer or another device with that capability. This, in theory, allows a mix of 5-pin and USB connections, but as previously mentioned, we abandoned that strategy. They allow filtering, transformation, and routing of MIDI data, which they store internally. For example, to prevent an older synth from responding to data on all MIDI channels, known as Omni mode, they allow for multiple inputs to feed the setup. As you can see from the diagram, both the KeyStep Pro and the Digitact can drive the entire setup. In order to use one or the other, we simply have to configure one to send clock and transport, while changing the other to receive clock and transport. Every other device is set up just to receive clock and transport. Every device has a unique MIDI channel, but we could use the CME MIDI ports to expand beyond 16 channels if needed. Not an issue in the foreseeable future, but nice to know. All devices can be addressed by the KeyStep Pro or the Digitact using their MIDI channel, but there are a few instances where channels do need to be changed, so that goal is not 100% achieved. For example, the Blofeld is 8-part multi-timbral, so one could use channels which overlap with other devices in using that capability. This is a rarity, and not a big deal to either filter what clashes or use spare MIDI channels. Another exception to one of the goals is that we need to unplug audio from a synth in order to use a mic in DAWless mode through the excellent 32-bit Zoom mixer. This is another edge case, which is only an issue if we were to be using all of the devices simultaneously. And now for the promised larger picture. To do this justice, it will be better addressed in a separate video, but there are two important points to mention. First of all, this setup is permanently part of a studio with a main MIDI controller, a computer, audio interface, and other pieces of gear. It is not a separate DAWless island used just by itself. When the full studio is in use, all of these devices function via MIDI over USB through a USB hub, which is set to take precedence on the devices. In DAWless mode, the USB hub is off, and 5-pin DIN is the only option for these devices to communicate. When not in DAWless mode, I do need to remember to set the Digitact and KeyStep to receive clock and transport. Secondly, All of the devices have a utility/update piece of software, or a full-blown software editor. This is true of every piece of gear you see in the photo, including the mixer. These tools only work when connected via USB to your computer. You could just connect them periodically as needed, but in our case, it is another reason that everything is also connected via USB. So that is it for this video. We are thankfully at a point where we spend little or no time running down MIDI-related issues, so we can focus on what got us here in the first place, making music.